The sun was almost hidden behind the horizon, leaving the forest in an ominous darkness. The wind played with the leaves, which whispered something disturbing. This road, mossy and abandoned for years, seemed like a place where time stood still. On the path, lit only by the dim rays of the setting sun, a wheelchair was moving. The wheels were heavy on the uneven ground, and every creak echoed through the deserted forest. In the wheelchair sat a little girl, her fragile body seeming especially vulnerable in the midst of the dense forest. She looked around, clutching the armrest so tight her knuckles turned white. Something about the silence was wrong, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The girl licked her parched lips and clutched the old plush toy tighter to her chest, the only thing that gave her a modicum of security. A noise from behind made her heart quicken. A bough was breaking. Someone was here. The girl turned sharply, but there was nothing visible in the thicket but the darkening shadows of the trees. "Who's there?" Her voice shook like a leaf in the wind. There was no answer, only another quiet crack, closer this time. A man suddenly emerged from the darkness of the forest. The figure, dressed in a police uniform, was imposing and menacing. He had a strained, almost menacing smile on his face, which didn't match the uniform he wore. The policeman walked slowly closer, his boots thudding against the dry leaves. "Lost, girl?" His voice was oily, almost mocking. He leaned a little closer to scrutinize her face, as if studying his prey. The girl pressed herself into the back of the wheelchair, trying to move away, but she couldn't move any further. There was a slope behind her. She knew she couldn't escape. Her breathing quickened. "Please, I just want to go home," she whispered, feeling fear creeping its icy fingers into her heart. The policeman grinned, his eyes glittering with something dark. He stood directly in front of her, blocking any escape route. His hand slid to his holster, but not to draw his gun. He patted it defiantly, as if checking to see if the girl understood who was in charge. "Home?" he asked mockingly, looking around. "Don't you think this forest is your home now?" His words were like a punch to the stomach. The girl felt tears running down her cheeks. She instinctively grabbed the wheels of the wheelchair, trying to turn around, but the policeman stepped forward and put his hand on the backrest. "Hush," he whispered, almost with a tenderness that was worse than any harsh word. "We don't want to hurt anyone, do we? Or do we?" The policeman leaned closer, his rough fingers pressing on the wheelchair's handle, forcing her to lean backward, nearly losing her balance. The girl cried out and gripped the armrests, her eyes widening in horror. She couldn't move, couldn't defend herself. "Well, little princess," he said, his voice full of venom, "where are your royal subjects?" "Oh yes," he laughed, bitter and contemptuous. "You are alone. As always, no one wants people like you." He straightened, but he didn't pull away, only stood even closer, towering over the girl like a mountain. His shadow obscured the last rays of the sun, making the girl's face almost invisible. "You know," he continued, leaning in so that his face was level with her head, "I've seen a lot of people like you, always thinking they're special. You think someone's going to save you here? You think anyone's going to want to get their hands dirty for you?" He grinned, baring his teeth. "A black girl in a wheelchair. No one. You. Don't. Need you." The words stabbed into her soul like knives. The girl tried to say something, but her voice stuck in her throat. A mixture of rage and despair burned inside her, but she knew there was nothing she could do. The policeman noticed her silence and hummed. "That's better," he said, running his finger along the wheelchair's handle, as if testing its strength. You know, sometimes I wonder why people like you live at all. Weak, useless, can't even walk. Your life is a burden on people like us. I'm here to protect real people, you know? Not people like you." His tone was like red-hot iron, scalding and unforgiving. He took a step back, examining the girl from head to toe, as if deciding what to do with her. Then he pointed to the toy she still clutched to her chest. "Is that your protector?" he asked, nodding at the tattered teddy bear. "It looks like he's the only one you have left. Too bad he can't help you, either." He reached out and grabbed the toy, snatching it from the girl's weakened hands. She screamed and tried to reach for it, but her wheelchair stuck treacherously on a tree root. The policeman raised the toy in front of her face, studying it as if he were about to pass judgment. "Do you know what happens to things like that?" he asked, his voice almost joyful now. "They disappear, like you will soon." With these words, he threw the teddy bear toward the cliff. The girl watched helplessly as her only comforting thing disappeared into the abyss. She wanted to scream, but the tears overwhelmed her. The policeman, pleased with her reaction, took a few steps back and leaned against the nearest tree, folding his arms across his chest. "That's how you live your lives," he said mockingly. "Always waiting for someone to come and save you. But you know what? The world isn't like that anymore. You don't belong here." He pulled a pack of cigarettes out of his pocket, lit one, and took a deep drag, watching her face and savoring every second of her pain. The girl raised her head, her tears mixing with the dirt on her cheeks. A small but bright light of resistance flickered in her eyes. She couldn't say anything else, but something new began to flare inside her, a desire to fight, even if it cost her life. The policeman noticed the look, his face twisted in a mocking grin. "What? You have something to say?" he asked, leaning closer again. "Well, say it. Go ahead. Or are you too much of a coward for that?" But the girl was silent, her gaze never leaving the policeman, like a predator waiting for the moment to attack. That moment was not far away. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you had something similar in your life or faced similar injustices? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. And now we continue. Through her tears, the girl still stared at the policeman. His sinister grin told her that she was his plaything, with no chance of rescue. He took another puff of his cigarette and blew the smoke into her face, enjoying her helplessness. "What, little princess? Are you hoping someone will jump out of the bushes and save you?" he began again, a chuckle in his voice. "People like you always think the world owes them something. But you're out here all alone, and you know why? Because no one will risk it for a pathetic black girl in a wheelchair. No one." Every word he said hit her harder, but she couldn't just sit there anymore. Fear was gripping her body, but something inside was screaming, "Move! Do something!" She glanced up the slope behind her. The abyss seemed endless, but the fear of falling was nothing compared to the terror of the man standing in front of her. Gritting her teeth, the girl grabbed the wheels of the wheelchair hard, trying to turn them with a strength she didn't seem to have. The wheelchair shuddered, but the root it had crashed into still held it. She pulled harder, as hard as she could. The policeman squinted, watching her efforts. "What are you doing?" he asked with a sneer, rising from his seat. "You think you can escape? Where are you gonna go, huh? In your condition? You can't even stand." But she wasn't listening to him anymore. Panic and survival drove her forward. She pressed the wheels again and again until finally the root gave way and the wheelchair shifted violently. It rolled forward along the path, bouncing clumsily over the bumps. "Are you serious?" shouted the policeman, throwing his cigarette on the ground. His footsteps became fast, and the girl heard the sound of gravel under his boots. "You'll only make things worse for yourself." He began to catch up with her, his voice growing louder and louder, but she didn't stop. The wheels were spinning with a wild screech, but the girl ignored the pain in her hands and arms. She knew one thing. If he caught her, it would all be over. The forest grew thicker and thicker, the path more and more winding. The wheelchair almost overturned when one of the wheels hit a deep pothole, but the girl kept her balance, fighting desperately for control. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Stop, damn it!" shouted a policeman from behind. "You're only making things worse for yourself, you dirty little refugee. You think I won't find you? You think you can run away from the law?" Those words burned her more than the cold evening air. "You can. You must," her inner voice whispered, urging her to keep going. But her strength was running out. She didn't know how much longer she could hold on when a gap between the trees appeared in front of her. It was a chance. She steered the wheelchair toward the light, but there was a deafening sound from behind. The policeman threw something and a rock hit the wheel with a crack, causing her to lose control. The stroller skidded on its side and the girl collapsed to the ground. Pain shot through her body, but there was no time for self-pity. The policeman came closer and closer, his shadow falling over her. She could hear his heavy breathing like a beast approaching its prey. "Well, where to now?" he said, standing directly above her. His hand reached for the belt where the baton hung. "Did you think you could get away?" The girl raised her head. Her eyes glistened with tears, but somewhere in the depths of her eyes there was still a light burning. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't give up. The girl lay on the cold ground, her hands shaking, her body aching from the fall. But worst of all was fear. It flooded her, paralyzing her like poison. Ahead, just a few meters away, the cliff was falling away into the void, as if the forest itself had surrendered her to this monster. Her wheelchair lay to the side, overturned and broken, no longer able to help her. The policeman stepped closer, his boots thudding on the ground. He stopped, standing over her, and looked down, like a predator that had just cornered its prey. His face, illuminated by the last rays of the setting sun, curved into a smug smile. "This is it," he said with cold certainty. "The end of the road. Honestly, I don't know why you even bothered. There's no place in this world for people like you." He squatted down, grabbing the girl by the collar of her shirt. She screamed, trying to pull away, but he lifted her up so that their eyes met. His gaze was full of hatred. "Look at you," he said, grinning wickedly. "No legs, no chance, no future. People like you are trash, living off people like me, walking around with your hand out for a handout, and you still think someone's gonna come after you? No, girl, you've always been alone. You always will be." He pulled her roughly to the edge of the cliff. The ground beneath her body became loose, and small pebbles tumbled downward, disappearing into the silence. The girl frantically grabbed at his hand, at anything she could reach, desperately clinging to life. "Please," she screamed, her voice shaking like broken glass. "Don't. I've done nothing wrong." The policeman laughed, abruptly throwing her closer to the edge. She felt her body slip, and then stopped, barely holding on. Her fingers dug convulsively into the loose soil. Another millimeter, and she would collapse. "Nothing bad?" he interjected, leaning over her. "You exist. That's good enough. You know, I could just leave you here. But why? It's better to make it quick." He came closer, lifted her by the shoulders, and began to drag her to the edge. The girl screamed even louder, her fingers clawing at the ground with all her might, pulling up clumps of dirt and grass. "No, no, please," she begged. Her heart was beating so hard that she almost didn't hear his taunts. Everything inside her screamed that this was the end. But in the darkest moment, when despair was about to consume her, something inside her flared up. It was a fire, a desire to live, a desire to fight, no matter what. "I won't give up," she whispered, almost soundlessly. But that whisper was stronger than a scream. The policeman didn't notice her words, but he saw her suddenly tense up. The girl turned sharply, her hands reaching for his legs. She hit him on the knee with everything she had, and he staggered, losing his balance. "You little," he roared, but the girl was already grabbing at the bushes that grew near the edge. She reached upward as he tried to regain control. The struggle turned into chaos. The policeman tried to hold her down, but his boot slipped on the gravel. He collapsed to his knees, and the girl, fists clenched, struck him again. Her fear vanished, giving way to rage. "It's not my fault you're a monster," she shouted, and her voice, trembling but firm, echoed over the cliff. At that moment, a noise was heard in the distance. Someone was approaching. The girl knew that time was running out. Her strength was running out, but she kept fighting. The policeman grabbed her again, his face contorted in rage. "I'm going to finish this anyway," he hissed, dragging her closer to the edge. "No one's going to save you." But the noise was getting louder. He froze for a moment, turning around, and the girl took advantage of the moment and twisted violently out of his grasp. The ground beneath his feet cracked. The policeman faltered, but the girl was already behind him, clinging to the bushes. She watched him balance, clinging to the air, but the slope left him no chance. "You!" His scream was cut short as the ground crumbled beneath him and he disappeared into the void. The girl, trembling, stayed at the edge. She couldn't believe it was over. Her heart was still clenched into a ball of fear, but somewhere in the distance a familiar voice was heard. "Father." She knew she would be safe now. The girl was trembling at the edge of the cliff, clinging to the bushes, her body on the verge of exhaustion. The policeman's sinister laughter still echoed in her head, his last words echoing in her mind. She couldn't tell if he had really fallen or if it was just her imagination. It was as if everything around her had frozen. "Kira! Kira! Where are you?" It was her father's voice. Tears sprang from her eyes, mixing with the dirt that covered her face. She tried to answer, but only a sob escaped. The sound of footsteps grew closer, and a man emerged from the shadows of the trees. His tall silhouette, framed by the remnants of the sunset light, was immediately reassuring. It was her father. His face contorted with horror as he saw his daughter on the edge of the cliff, her broken wheelchair and the emptiness around her. "Kira!" He rushed to her, kneeling beside her and wrapping his arms around her trembling body. His arms held her tightly, as if he was afraid she would disappear. "I am here. I'm with you." She burst into tears, clinging to his jacket, her small hands frantically grasping the fabric as if it were the only saving island. But the joy of the encounter quickly gave way to a new fear. Her eyes widened, and she whispered, He wanted to kill me." Her father froze, his face darkening momentarily. He held her even tighter to him, trying to muffle her words, as if the very fact that she had said them made what had happened real. His gaze fell on the broken wheelchair, the scattered earth, the signs of a struggle. anger, like fire, filled his heart. Who was that? His voice was low, hoarse, almost a growl. Who dare? Kira pointed toward the woods, toward where the figure of the policeman had disappeared. Her father rose slowly, his eyes full of rage, searching the dark forest. He spotted a uniform lying nearby, just below the slope. The policeman didn't fall all the way down. He had caught himself on a branch and was now slowly pulling himself back up. "You?" Kira's father shouted so loudly that it echoed throughout the forest. He stepped to the edge of the cliff, glaring at the man in a police uniform who was climbing up. "You dare touch my daughter?" The policeman raised his head, his face contorted with pain and anger, but not fear. He smirked, breathing hard. "Ah, here comes the hero," he said, trying to pull himself up higher. "Typical nigger daddy. You think you can do something? You're always like this, loud but worthless." The policeman's words struck like a whip, but Kira's father didn't even flinch. His hands clenched into fists, and he took another step closer to the edge, looking straight into the eyes of his enemy. "You tried to kill my daughter," he said slowly, each word filled with hatred. "You have no idea what I'll do to you." The policeman laughed, his laughter harsh and short. "Your daughter?" He nodded toward Kira. "She's not even human. She's a liability, useless. And now you want to threaten me? Me, a man of the law? You have no idea who I am." Kira's father did not answer. Instead, he walked down the slope toward the man, who was now almost on his feet. The policeman noticed his approach and drew his baton from his belt. "What, you want to try your hand?" he said, holding his baton out in front of him. "You know you can't do that." But Kira's father did not stop. His steps were sure, like a man with nothing to lose. When he was close enough, the policeman swung, but his father intercepted his hand, twisting it with such force that the baton fell from his fingers. The policeman cried out in pain, but that was only the beginning. "You touched my daughter," the father said through gritted teeth, his voice soaked with rage. "Did you think you could just use your power to destroy her?" With these words, he punched the policeman in the stomach, causing him to bend over. He then grabbed him by the collar and raised his face to his own. "Look at me," he growled. "Look into the eyes of the man who won't let you get away with it." The policeman, panting, tried to answer, but his words were drowned in his father's fierce scream. He threw him to the ground, not allowing him to rise, his blows precise and merciless. All he felt was anger for his daughter, that she could die because of this monster. Kira watched from behind, her heart torn between fear and hope. She saw her father's strength, his determination to protect her at all costs, and she knew this moment would change everything. Kira's father stood over the policeman, his breathing heavy and his fists clenched to the point of pain. He saw in front of him not a man, but a monster who dared to make an attempt on his daughter's life. The policeman tried to get up, but he pinned him to the ground again, grabbing him by the collar of his uniform and pulling his face closer. "Did you think you could kill her and then just walk away?" he growled, his voice full of rage and contempt. "Did you think you could get away with it, like you always do?" The policeman laughed hoarsely, his lips stained with blood, but even that didn't stop him from jeering. "Like always?" He looked straight into Kira's father's eyes, grinning. "You have no idea how this world works. I am the law. I'm the power. And you know what the funny thing is? Nobody's gonna believe you. Nobody's even gonna listen. You're black. What about her?" He nodded toward Kira, who, frightened, watched from a distance. "She doesn't mean anything. No matter how much you fight for her, it won't change one thing. You're both nobodies." The words were like a stabbing blow. Kira's father trembled with anger, but did not loosen his grip. He saw the man's face twisted in pain and anger, and realized that he still thought he was the winner. "No one," he repeated, his voice turning icy. "Are you saying that my daughter, this little girl who just fought for her life, is no one to you?" He punched the policeman in the face, causing him to throw back his head. He groaned, but after a moment he looked up at him again, smiling wryly. "Yes," he said, his voice filled with contempt. "She'll always be a nobody. She can't even walk. How many like her have I seen? They only slow the world down. You all just slow it down." With those words, he spat in Kira's father's face, his eyes burning with hatred. That was the last straw. His father grabbed him by the chest and lifted him up with force, forcing the policeman to his knees, then threw him sharply to the ground. "You're the one who's nothing," he said, leaning over him. "You hide behind your uniform, behind your power. But without it, you're just a coward who thinks he can humiliate others to feel strong." The policeman tried to reach for his baton, which was lying nearby, but his father noticed it. He stepped on his hand, causing him to scream in pain. "You wanted to break her life," he continued, his voice low and threatening. "But I wouldn't let you. Not ever." The policeman tried to struggle, his free hand hitting Kira's father on the leg, causing him to stagger slightly. He used the moment to roll to and grab the baton. He got to his feet and stood in front of Kira's father, waving the weapon. "You think you've won?" he said, his voice hoarse but still mocking. "But you'll still be what you are, trash. Even if you kill me, it won't change anything." Kira's father didn't back down. His eyes burned, his body tense as a string. He knew this man would keep threatening until he broke him. But he also knew he couldn't lose. Not here, not now. "You don't understand," he said, taking a step forward. "You've already lost. Because my daughter's alive, because she's stronger than you, and because I won't let you raise your hand against someone like her again." The policeman lunged forward, swinging his baton. Kira's father ducked, then punched him sharply in the stomach, knocking the air out. The policeman staggered, but did not fall. His eyes glittered with rage, and he tried to strike again, but Kira's father intercepted his arm, twisting it with such force that the baton fell to the ground. The fight turned into a desperate struggle, their bodies clashing, their hands trying to find a weak spot in their opponent's defenses. "You won't get anywhere," the cop wheezed, trying to free himself. "The system has always been on my side. Always." "The system," Kira's father answered, his voice almost calm. "The system won't save you today." He shoved the policeman sharply backward, causing him to fall to the ground. He was standing over him now, his shadow completely obscured by the man who had tried to kill his daughter a few minutes ago. "You've lost," he said, his voice sounding like a sentence, "and no one else will suffer at your hands." The girl looked at her father from afar. Her heart, frightened and hurt, felt secure for the first time in a long time. There was justice ahead, but now it was their victory. Let's pause for one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from. Have you had something similar in your life or faced similar injustices? Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. And now we continue. The silence of the forest was broken by the sounds of fighting, heavy blows, shrieks, and the cracking of twigs underfoot. The policeman, covered in mud and blood running down his face, was breathing heavily, looking at Kira's father standing in front of him. He didn't let himself relax, his eyes fixed on his enemy, ready to attack again. But this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for justice, for his daughter to never again feel helpless in the face of hate. "You think you've won?" The policeman wheezed, trying to rise to his feet. His voice was venomous, and his words were as contemptuous as before. "But you've just signed your own verdict. When I get out of here, I will destroy you and your daughter. People like you can always be broken. We always win." He smiled, wiping the blood from his face, but Kira's father remained unfazed. He stepped closer, his steps sure, but his gaze worried for the girl who still sat on the ground nearby, trembling with fear. He knew he had to end this quickly. This man was a threat that could not be left unpunished. The policeman suddenly lunged at him, but his father was ready. His fist met the policeman's face with such force that he collapsed to the ground again. Instead of remaining lying there, however, the policeman, breathing heavily, reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. His eyes glittered with rage, and he clenched his teeth as he pointed the weapon at his adversary. "I said," he hissed, rising slowly, "you will never win. Never." Kira's father took a step back, watching his movements carefully. He could feel the tension in the air thickening into an almost palpable danger. The policeman was waving a knife, clearly intending to attack, but his father had another reason to worry. Kira. She tried to crawl away, shivering, but her wheelchair, overturned and broken, lay too close to the edge of the cliff. She looked at her father, her eyes full of terror, and he saw it. She knew he was fighting for her, but she couldn't shake the fear that something would go wrong. The policeman noticed her movement and grinned, changing his trajectory abruptly. He lunged not at his father, but at Kira. That moment, as if slowed down, was like a lightning strike to his father. The policeman knew he couldn't beat his father in a fair fight, but he had another way to strike. "Don't you dare!" my father shouted, rushing forward, but it was too late. The policeman grabbed the wheelchair and in one motion dragged it to the very edge. Kira screamed, her hands clutching at the ground in panic, but her strength was failing her. Her father stopped, frozen for a moment, his heart pounding frantically. One false step, and it was over. "Get back!" shouted the policeman, holding the knife at his side. One more step, and she would go flying down. My father froze, his fists clenched so tightly that his nails dug into his palms. The policeman stared at him, grinning, like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "That's how we'll end up," he said, clutching the wheelchair. "You always think you deserve more than you have, that you should be saved. And the truth is, you're just dirt, and your daughter is no better. She can't even save herself. Look at her. Weak, useless, that's how you'll stay." "You're wrong," my father said quietly. His voice was steady, but it had a steely determination in it. "She is stronger than you. She's stronger than anything you say, and I won't let you break her." The policeman, furious at his words, took another step back, but the ground beneath his feet began to crumble. It was a brief moment, but in it my father saw a chance. He lunged forward, grabbing the wheelchair and pushing the policeman to the ground at the same time. He cried out, his knife flying out of his hand, but he managed to grab the edge of the cliff. Kira, still in the stroller, was rescued, but her father, fighting with his last strength, tried to hold on to her so she wouldn't roll away. He could feel her weight pulling them both to the edge, but he didn't give up. The policeman, hanging on the edge, wheezed and screamed, "You're gonna regret this. You'll regret it." But the father wasn't listening anymore. He lifted his daughter, her tears streaming down her cheeks as he finally set her on the ground away from the cliff. He put his arms around her, pulling her tight against him. The policeman snapped, his scream echoing through the void, and then all was silent. Only the wind whistled, as if to carry away the remnants of the horror. The father, breathing heavily, looked at his daughter. She was safe. She was alive, and that was what mattered most. Silence hung over the forest as if the air itself had frozen with tension. Her father held Kyra in his arms, feeling her body shake with crying. Her wheelchair lay off to the side, cowering and damaged from the struggle. He knew their rescue was only temporary. The danger was not yet over. Inside his father, everything was boiling. The policeman, his hatred and cruelty, this confrontation, everything had left deep wounds in him. He couldn't allow himself to break. He had no right to be weak. Kyra needed him more than ever. But then he heard a rustle. The wind? No, it was something else, barely perceptible but real. He tensed, lifting his head. His eyes slid to the edge of the cliff where the ground had been torn up and the policeman seemed to have disappeared. But the noise didn't stop. Suddenly, figures appeared from behind the trees. 2 men, also in police uniforms, with stern faces, were walking along the path toward them. Kyra's father immediately realized that these men were not here by chance. Their gazes were directed at him, and their hands reached for their weapons. His heart clenched. What happened here? One of them, a tall man with a cold stare, said. His tone didn't imply questions. It was an order. The other, a little younger man, eyed them both suspiciously. Kyra's father slowly stood up, still defending his daughter. He realized that his every word would be used against him. These men had not come to seek justice. They had come for their own. They came to protect their own. This man, he began, his voice flat but full of rage. He tried to kill my daughter. He pushed her out of her wheelchair and tried to throw her over a cliff. Where is he? The second policeman interrupted, his hand already on the grip of his gun. His gaze slid to the edge of the cliff. Where is our man? His father fell silent. He couldn't afford to admit that he'd snapped, but he couldn't lie either. His silence made everything obvious. Did you kill him? The first policeman asked, his voice harder. You and your girl? No. Kyra finally found the strength to speak. Her voice was weak, but her words were like the cry of her soul. He tried to kill me. He said I was useless, that we were nothing. He... That's enough. The policeman interrupted her. His cold gaze stopped on her like a knife. Do you think anyone will believe you? You know who we are? We're the law. And if you killed one of us, you'll be held accountable. She didn't do anything? His father's voice rumbled like thunder. He stepped forward, covering Kyra with himself. That man attacked us. You want to know the truth? Then look at the footprints, at the broken wheelchair, at her hands stained in the mud where she clung to the ground to save herself. He was the monster, not her. But the policemen were not listening. Their looks told them that they had already passed judgment. Kyra's father realized it when the first of them reached for the radio. We can't just leave it at that, he said into the radio, his voice calm. One of ours is missing, probably murdered. We'll apprehend the suspects. We will. Those words sounded like a sentence. Kyra's father felt something inside him explode. He looked at his daughter. Her eyes, full of fear, were begging him to do something. He knew that if they fell into the hands of these people, they would never know the truth. Their stories would never be heard. You're not taking her, he said, his voice hard. His hands clenched into fists again. She's a child. She's been through something no one should have to go through, and you're not taking her." The first policeman hummed and took a step forward. "Do you really think you have a choice?" he asked. "You're up against the system, and the system always wins." But Kira's father didn't move. He knew this wasn't a fight for life. This was a fight for her future. If he gave up, if he let them take her, all would be lost. He had to make a choice, and he made it. With a sudden movement, he grabbed a branch from the ground next to him and stepped forward, knocking away the hand of the policeman who was reaching for his gun. The second policeman shouted something, but his father had already rushed back, grabbing Kira in his arms. He could feel her heart pounding, her weak body pressed against him, and it only made him more determined. "Run!" one of the policemen shouted, but my father was already racing down the path, leaving the cliff and their threats behind him. He knew it wasn't over. The price of salvation was just beginning. Sirens cut through the silence of the forest, their howls seeming an ominous harbinger of things to come. The flashers illuminated the trees, casting a cold blue light on the wet ground and the steep slope. One by one, police cars filled the path, and armed men stepped out of them, purposeful, wary, but not dispassionate. In each of their eyes, they were here to protect their own. Kira's father, clutching his daughter in his arms, sat by the tree, breathing heavily. His heart was still racing from his escape, and his mind was torn between fear and determination to protect her. He heard footsteps approaching and knew there was nowhere else to retreat. The first to approach them was an officer, a senior officer with a stern face and a keen gaze. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and the badge on his chest gleamed like a reminder of authority. He stopped, looking down at a man and a child in a dirty, broken wheelchair. His gaze lingered on the girl, but there was no sympathy in it. "Is that you?" he asked sharply, his voice sounding like an order. "Are you the one who attacked Officer Johnson?" Father looked up, his gaze tired but firm. "This man attacked my daughter," he said slowly, each word filled with pain and rage. "He tried to push her off the cliff. He threatened her life." The officer did not answer immediately. He looked around the scene, his eyes quickly running over the scattered earth, the signs of a struggle, and the broken wheelchair. But his face remained impassive. "Where is Officer Johnson?" he asked one of them. "He's gone, sir," he replied, looking at the cliff. "Presumably he has fallen." The senior officer froze, then slowly turned to Kira's father. His gaze grew even colder. "So you killed him," he said, putting his hands on his gun belt. "You killed a policeman." "No!" Kira exclaimed sharply, her voice trembling, but she couldn't keep quiet. "He snapped on his own. He tried to kill me. He said I was nothing, that we—" "That's enough," the officer interrupted her, waving his hand as if waving away an annoying fly. His voice was soaked with irritation. "You're a child. No one's blaming you. But your father, my father protected me," she shouted, her eyes glistening with tears. "You don't understand. He wanted me to die." The officer looked at her, then at her father. There was no sympathy in his eyes, no interest in the truth. He stepped closer, hovering over the man. "Here's how it's going to work," he said, his voice lower but even more threatening. "You're the man who assaulted the officer, killed him. You expect us to believe you? A black man, fugitive, dirty, with a history of aggression against our own? We know your kind." Those words were a blow to the heart. Kira's father clenched his teeth, his arms instinctively hugging his daughter tighter. He saw in the officer's eyes not a desire to get to the truth, but a desire to close the case, to protect his men. "That man tried to kill my daughter," he repeated, his voice tense but calm. "You know it. You see it. She's not lying." "And who will confirm her words?" the officer said with a chuckle, turning to his men. "A broken wheelchair? That's not proof. Your words, they're just words. We have a missing officer, and you're the last person to see him." "It's not true," Kira cried out, her body shuddering with crying. "He saved me. Why won't you listen?" But they didn't care about her opinion. One of the policemen walked up to the older man and whispered something in his ear. The officer nodded, then turned back to Kira's father. "You're under arrest," he said, pulling out his handcuffs, "for assaulting a police officer, for murder. You can try to prove your innocence, but believe me, there are thousands of cases like yours, and you know how they end." Kira's father realized that the truth didn't matter here. His heart clenched, but he couldn't allow himself to give up. He had to protect his daughter. He looked into her eyes. Her face was haggard, but her gaze still burned with hope. "I'll do anything to keep you safe," he said quietly. Then, rising, he held out his hands, letting them be cuffed. "You're making a mistake," he said, looking straight into the officer's eyes. "But I'll still prove the truth, for her sake." The sirens wailed again. One by one, the police cars drove away, leaving behind them the silence of the forest, which seemed frozen, as if afraid to disturb the moment. 3 months had passed since that night in the forest, but its echoes continued to haunt Kira like a shadow from which there was no escape. She was back in her wheelchair, now a new one, purchased through a charity fund. The wheels rolled smoothly along the path in the park, but every creak reminded her of what had happened. She couldn't forget how her father had led her away from the cliff, how the police had handcuffed him, how the sirens had driven him away into the unknown. Her father was in prison. The charge was serious: killing an off-duty police officer. They claimed that he attacked Officer Johnson without provocation, that he was acting within the law and trying to subdue a violent man. Kira's version, a little black girl in a wheelchair, was ignored. "Children often fantasize," prosecuting attorneys said. Even her fear and tears couldn't shake their confidence in their case. Her mother, who still lived in another city, was forced to return to take care of Kira, but even she didn't believe justice would be served. "It's always been an unequal fight," she said, looking at the case reports where all the evidence was skewed in favor of the police. "The system protects its own." Kira felt like her father was dying alive behind bars. Every short date they had was agony. He looked older than his years, his arms trembling as he hugged her, but the fire she'd seen that night still burned in his eyes. "I'm fighting, sweetheart," he said, his voice firm despite his fatigue. "I won't let them win. For you." The trial became a farce. All the evidence against her father was based on the testimony of 2 officers who arrived after Johnson's disappearance. They claimed to have found signs of a struggle and suggested that Kira's father had killed the policeman to cover up his actions. The father's defense attorney tried to present the case differently, but all of his arguments were drowned in a flood of accusations. "He could have run away," the prosecutor stated, "but instead he chose to attack." That's typical of people like him: irresponsible, aggressive, dangerous. Those words burned Kira from the inside out. She wanted to scream that her father had never been like that. He protected her because no one else did, but no one would listen to her. Her voice, like her existence, was insignificant to them. The day of the verdict came. The courtroom was full, but the atmosphere was oppressive. Kira's father stood in the center, his hands cuffed, but he held his head high. The judge announced his verdict. Guilty. Life imprisonment. Kira couldn't hold back her tears. Her mother quietly wiped hers away, but there was anger in her eyes, suppressed but burning. They walked out of the courtroom, knowing they had a long road ahead of them to fight for the truth. Life after the trial became like an ongoing battle. Kira began to collect her father's story, writing down every moment, every detail of their life, their suffering. She sought out journalists, lawyers, anyone who could help. Many refused, afraid to get involved with a case that could bring the wrath of the system upon them. But there were those who listened. Gradually, her story began to resonate. Publications about the unfair accusation appeared on social networks. People started asking questions, looking for evidence, but even this was not enough. The authorities protected their own, and Kira was just a girl in a wheelchair whose story seemed too incredible for many. One evening, Kira sat on her bed holding an old photograph of her father. They were both smiling in the background, and the wheelchair was decorated with colorful ribbons. Back then, the world seemed bright and the future seemed promising. Now, it seemed like everything had fallen apart. But she remembered his words, "I'm fighting. For you." And she realized she couldn't give up. "This is not the end," she whispered, her voice firm. "We will continue, for his sake, for the truth, years of struggle ahead." But Kira, sitting in her wheelchair, knew she would never stop. This tragedy had shattered their family, but it had also shown her that the truth deserved a fight, even if the odds seemed impossible. The system that betrayed them would not stand forever. And one day, she knew their story could make a difference. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism in your life? Your opinions are very important to us, and we sincerely appreciate each of you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like to support us. We wish you a good day and always stand for the truth.